I'm going to talk about God with us today, and the very first picture we're going to show you is, Elena said a little bit about me, but I'm going to say a little bit about my family. That's my family. We came to Central from another local church where my husband was the pastor for about 10 years, and so we've kind of trickled in over the last year and a half as he finished up his tenure at being pastor at the end of last year. So on the far, your right, my left, is my oldest son, Ben, and his new wife, Hannah. They got married Memorial Day weekend. The week after that, once ProPresenter disappears, the middle one in the gown, that's my daughter, Maggie. She graduated. And the week after that, she moved out. And then 3 days after that, Wendell took the rest of the children, Brendan, Naya, and Mira, with the look on her face. He took them to Oklahoma for about 9 days to visit his family, that's where Wendell's from. And as a result, we're kind of tired and a little bit not recovered. And I lost my voice the weekend of my son's wedding, and it is still not all the way back. So if I sound like a lifelong smoker at the end of this service, you will understand why. I'm still recovering. I'm going to tell you a little bit about growing up. I grew up with a mama who read me the Bible nearly every day. Not in a family quiet time kind of way. We weren't like a family devotional kind of family, but just in an everyday, this is how she lived her life kind of way. I do not remember a morning when I didn't come down to the kitchen and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her Bible open and a cup of tea because she doesn't drink coffee. And I want to say this, Julie Fisher does not shy away from the hard parts of the Bible, not at all. So I learned about like donkey bodily fluids and dismembered bodies maybe long before it was developmentally appropriate. And I see some faces right now. Those stories are found in Ezekiel, Judges, respectively. If you want to like read some salacious Bible stories this week, now you have your homework. I've read the Bible through every year since I was 16 years old. And I don't say that to make you think I'm a more holy Christian. That is for sure not the truth. You can ask my husband and children. Maybe do not ask my husband and children for verification because they will likely not lie to you. It doesn't make me better. It's because I love the Bible. I love the scriptures. It does mean, though, that my instinct when Elena asked me to preach was to lean into that piece that I really love, like the story and the history and the literary context of it, and like talk about like a Hebrew and a Greek word, and really something so that you could see how like impressively intellectual I am. But instead, God led me somewhere a little different, a little more personal, a little more vulnerable, because number one, it's a piece that I can't intellectually or academically explain, and number two, it's something I still struggle with. The piece of God's story that I found much more powerful than any academic study of the Bible or Christianity in general. And we've been speaking all month about a good and faithful God, one who sees us, like Megan talked about, one who knows us, like Nicole talked about, one who cares for us, like Jeremiah talked about. And I'm going to finish up with a God who's with us, the very basis of God's interaction with humans. I particularly love the Old Testament, like I said. I know that's sort of unpopular in an age of like deconstruction and questioning and stuff, and frankly, it doesn't matter to me what you bring to this conversation, if you think it's literally true or figuratively true or just fairy tales. I'm saying I think that all of those stories, no matter what you believe about them, point to God. They point to how he is with his people over time. But the Old Testament ends, right? And then we can just flip the page and the New Testament begins. And it's just like one page in our scriptures. But in reality, there was 400 years between the Old Testament, the New Testament, where nothing was written. 400 years where there's no recorded word of God, where there's no official word from the Lord about what to do or how to live. It's not to say nothing happened. There were like multiple empires during that time. There were religious factions that developed. I'm going to guess those people probably felt kind of alone, maybe confused. But God's answer to those 400 years of changing governments and divisive religion, that's the piece that lets me sit kind of in this broken place where we live with hope. It keeps me engaged when my kids ask questions that I don't know the answers to. It keeps me coming back to Jesus again and again and again. He didn't end this long silent period with this political party is the right one, or here's the right religious faction that you're supposed to belong to, or here are the right things to do in every situation, or what will fix all of this is all of you having this list of right beliefs. He doesn't do that. We're told God's answer in the very first chapter of Matthew, the very first book in the New Testament, 20 through 23. It's the story of an angel coming to Joseph in a dream, telling him that the girl he's supposed to marry was pregnant. Matthew writes, and the angel tells Joseph, she will give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus, because he will save the people from their sins. This all happened so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Look, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. The very thing promised in the Old Testament by the prophet Isaiah is God's answer after 400 years of what felt like silence. It wasn't a Christian living manifesto. It wasn't a command to belong to the right political party or the right religious denomination. It was a person. It was Jesus, God with us. I think I have the same kinds of questions that those people living through those 400 years probably had. In the face of like loud voices and uncertain governments and pain and fear, and sometimes what I feel like is silence from God in the face of all those hard things. Mine might look more like, is God good? When my kids experience intense pain and trauma, is God there when I feel utterly abandoned by family or betrayed by friends? Does God see me when my loneliness rises, even though I live in a home that's full of people? What I know, and I can't prove it and I can't intellectualize it. It's just a thing I know, and my God is true. God is with me. God's answer to division and uncertain circumstances and what seems like silence is the same now as it was then. His answer was coming here, in the flesh, with us. It's how we're introduced to him. At the beginning of this book, in Genesis 3, in the garden, after creation, in the garden with Adam and Eve, God walked with them and talked with them. And he was with them there in the garden. And in the end of this book that we've been given, in Revelation, God's on his throne, and every tongue and tribe and nation are there before him. He's with them there too, the whole way through. And in the middle, John 1:14 tells us, the Word, that's Jesus, became flesh and blood, and he moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. God literally comes to be with people in the form of a human man. That piece of God's story is woven the whole way through. So I feel like there's nothing more biblical or relevant than to talk about what that might look like, what it's looked like for me, what it might look like for us to do for others. We don't live at the same time as a tangible human in the flesh Jesus, obviously. So he can't come to us and prove he's real like he did with Thomas. If you don't know this story, we're going to go to John 20, 24 through 31. I'm going to paraphrase, so if you don't want to turn there, feel free to just listen. Thomas was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and Jesus was killed, and 3 days later he rose from the dead, and after he was resurrected, he came and appeared to his disciples. And there was just this one, Thomas, and lots of people call him Doubting Thomas for reasons you're about to find out. I'd like to maybe call him brave, because I think he asked a question that probably a lot more people had and just weren't willing to voice, because Thomas was like, this doesn't seem likely, because we don't know people that rise from the dead. That doesn't usually happen. It probably doesn't seem like this is really you. I'm going to have to kind of touch you. I might have to see the wounds where you were crucified before I believe that it's really, truly you. And Jesus doesn't say, oof, no. If you do not believe just by faith alone and not do anything, then it doesn't count. It's not real. What Jesus says is, come. He says, you can touch me. You can put your fingers in the wounds where I was crucified. I am the tangible evidence that this is real. I'm a lot like Thomas, I think. Every time I walk in nature, or I pray, or I read the Bible, I just feel like God is with me. And sometimes that happens. It does. But sometimes I maybe need a little bit more tangible evidence. I need a little proof, which might make my faith a little weak. That's true. But I think we learn from this story that Jesus doesn't criticize us for that. He gives us what we're looking for. I think that the way I experience God most clearly and most often is through people. People remind me that God has not forgotten me. And it's God himself that modeled that for us. And I think that we almost always are the God with us piece of this world for other people too. So the question remains, how do we do that? What does it look like? I'm just going to share some of the things that God is teaching me about how to be with people through how other people have been with me. So we're going to go back to the very first piece of the scripture that Larry read for us at the beginning of the service. Philippians 2:5 says, "In your relationships with one another." Those first 6 words were set up from the very beginning of the passage to know that this passage is about how we're supposed to be with one another based on how Jesus was with us. I'm going to go back to verse 5, but this time I'm going to read from the Passion Translation, which is one of my favorites. I recommend it if you guys have never read from that translation. Verse 5 in that translation says, "And consider the example that Jesus, the Anointed One, has set before us. Let his mindset become your motivation." That's the piece for this part of the verse. We have to have a mindset like Jesus. That's the intention piece. I like to call this the just show up piece of the equation. Sometimes all we got to do is show up. That's hard for me because while I'm a functional extrovert, I am extremely introverted at heart, and I would much prefer to stay home with my family, better yet, even alone. I would prefer to come late, leave early, sit by myself. It takes an effort for me to change my mindset to be with others around me. I know sometimes that makes me come across as aloof at best, rude at worst, so it's a piece that I'm continually working on to make myself more like Jesus. And while I've been writing this story, or this sermon, something that kind of embarrassing happened to me because I'm in the middle of talking about this, like God with us and how we're supposed to be with other people. And I've been thinking and praying about it. And 2 weeks ago at the fellowship meal that we had here after church, I got my food, I walked through the line, I clocked who was sitting at each table, and then I chose to sit at the table where nobody else was sitting. Because it's just my natural instinct. Should I have sat at a different table? Sure. But it seemed like the easiest thing to sit at a table where no one else was sitting. And someone else in this congregation who was already seated and eating took their plate and their cup and got up and came to sit by me at the table. And I was like, oh man, I have messed this up. I should have been there with the mindset of Jesus. It's a piece I'm continually working on. And one of the biggest ways I do that is I sit on my front porch. I know Aaron Earlywine already talked to us about this, but I think it's a point that bears repeating. On your right, you will see the views from my front porch. The pillars at the bottom picture, that's my front porch. That's how close we are to the road. We live on Main Street in our town. And it's close. It's loud. Sometimes there are parades, like you can see. And the pic on my left, that's my backyard. We have almost 5 acres behind our house. It backs up to wetlands, and then there's the Mad River past that. And it is beautiful and quiet, and there's birds and deer, and we have a great horned owl that lives back there, and I would much rather be in the backyard where no one can see me. But this is the piece I'm working on. I sit on my front porch. I sit right next to the road. We're not exactly unknown in our little community. Wendell used to be a pastor for 10 years. He also works for our local fire department. I served on the school board for 5 years, and we have 5 kids in and out of our schools and sports, so people know us. And they see us, and they honk, and they wave, and sometimes they stop by unannounced, which is, not my favorite thing that happens, but it's a piece that I put myself out there to do. I show up on my front porch because that gives me opportunity to be with people. It doesn't take any extra effort. It just takes intention. The next point, in the very next verses, Philippians 2:6-7, he existed in the form of God, yet he gave no thought to seizing equality with God as his supreme prize. Instead, he emptied himself of his outward glory by reducing himself to the form of a lowly servant. He became human. Being with people takes effort. God came here. He didn't take us all to him. He came right here in our neighborhood. He physically emptied himself of glory. He reduced himself to be a servant. He came to this dirty and broken and beautiful world to be with people. So this is my show and tell piece of the morning. Do any of you have a rock collection? No? My kids have rock collections. Probably the rest of the children in Kids Central is more the demographic for this. But then I'm going to out myself as a weird adult who has like piles of rocks on her bookshelf and her nightstand and her desk. But I tend to pick up things from places where I feel like God has been with me, where I know for sure that his people have shown me that he's with me. I have, like, this one is from Maine. They come from all over. And this one's from my backyard when we moved in. It was an answer to prayer that we got the property we did. I picked that one up there. This one is from North Carolina. This one's from Hawaii. Like, I just have these little mementos. But most of them are these, like, sparkly gold rocks, which I'm sure have an actual name that someone smarter than me knows. I'm going to call them sparkly gold rocks. And they come from a really specific lake in Georgia where I spent the several years in a row. We were, a bit of our story, foster parents for 10 years. And when we started, we didn't know anybody else that was walking the same road, not one person. And there is one thing I will absolutely tell you about being a foster parent. It's that you need a community of people to surround you, to support you. And our regular community, our church, our family, our friends, they were great. They were loving, they were supportive, but they did not understand. Some of those people have to be people that are walking the same road. So in lieu of in real life people, which I had not met yet, I found that community online, through Facebook, through blogs, because this was back in the day when blogs were a thing. I found this conference for foster and adoptive moms in Georgia, and in like a desperate whim, because I just felt so alone, I booked a last-minute ticket to that conference. I booked airfare. I crowdsourced lodging on the conference Facebook page because all of the hotel rooms were booked at that point because it was a last-minute thing. And my husband drove me to the airport that morning for me to leave, and I don't know that he literally shoved me out of the car, but it might have been pretty close to that because I was like, nope, I'm just going to go back home. I didn't know anyone there. I was going completely alone. But he made me get out of the car, and I got on that plane, and I ended up in the Atlanta airport meeting a stranger who greeted me with, I guess we're sharing a bed tonight. And it was like, yay. Please understand me, like, I hate the cabin portion of summer camps. That was not my vibe. I did not live on campus as a college student. I never was in a sorority. I moved straight from my parents' house, where I had my own room for my entire life, into my first apartment with my husband. So this was not my vibe at all. And it took everything within me to get on that plane, to get in that rental car, to get into that king-size bed that night. And praise Jesus, it was a king-size bed because I didn't actually have to touch a stranger with that woman. But it was nothing. There's nothing in my life that I've done that has been more impactful than that. It gave me a community of mamas that were walking the same road that I was. I met a lady there who was local to me and who is still my friend today. I spent hours next to that lake. The pictures show crying, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, praying. And I picked up a rock year after year after year because it reminds me that God was with me in that hard and lonely place. And the effort that it took for me to go there, to be there, to meet new people, to sit with others when I'd rather sit alone, it was worth it because I got a community of God's people that came to be with me. But the biggest piece of that, I think, is the part we're going to talk about next. In verse 8, it reads, he humbled himself, he became vulnerable, choosing to be revealed as a man, and he was obedient. He was a perfect example, even in his death, a criminal's death by crucifixion. Being with people takes vulnerability. My decade as a foster parent will probably always be one of the most defining pieces of my life. I learned more about myself, more about kids, more about others, more about Jesus during those 10 years than anything else I've done. But I also told myself a lot of lies about my role in that situation. Some of them were myriad, and some of them are fairly embarrassing. But the one I'm going to tell you about today is maybe the biggest. And it's about trauma. We spent years learning about trauma. Chris and Megan and Jill did an excellent job talking about like capital T traumas and little t traumas, like the everyday things that affect us versus the big events, the big traumatic events that affect us. They talked about that a couple months ago in the mental health session, and I learned a lot about it I thought, we're going to figure out what it looks like in the lives of a kid. We're going to figure out what it looks like in the day-to-day and what it looks like when they grow up. And it never once occurred to me that that maybe wasn't the whole story. I thought trauma was a thing that occurred out there. Like, this is where the trauma happens. And then the children, we're going to bring them into our home where the trauma does not happen. And it's not like I thought we were the healers necessarily. I just thought we were going to be a piece of healing that in those kids, and that we would love them, and this was the safe, secure place where the trauma doesn't happen. And it never occurred to me, not one time, that a capital T trauma could occur in our family while our kids lived with us. So about 2 years ago, I was in the dark middle of what I can easily say was the biggest crisis of my life. A capital T trauma occurred with one of my kids, and it occurred on my watch. My child told me about it in the words that they had. They came to me again and again and again, and I dismissed it as other stuff, other things that were happening. And then when we found out what had really happened, I felt responsible. I felt guilty. I felt like a failure. I felt angry with myself, with God, with all of this story that I had told myself about how trauma is out here and in here is safe. I took all of that out on my family, to be honest. It was not pretty. I was not dealing with it very well, in spite of being in therapy every week and all of that. I just wasn't dealing with it very well. And in desperation, I reached out to a friend on Facebook, and one that I knew had experienced a similar trauma, and I asked her a question. And in the space of a day, that friend booked a flight from several states away. She DoorDashed groceries to my front porch, and she spent 36 hours in my living room. If you had asked me if I needed her, I would have said no. If you'd asked me if I wanted her to come, I still would have said no. And that's not what she did. She said, I think I'm supposed to come. Here's what I'm going to do. Here are the days I can be there. You can pick from this date or this date. And that was the end of it. I don't want you to mistake this for some kind of lifelong best friendship. We did not call or text daily, even weekly. We had just spent time in a community together once upon a time, and once we had gone our separate ways to different states, like we just kept up with each other's families on Facebook. That's the extent of our relationship. So it was an uncomfortable act of humility for me to say yes, but I did it without hesitation, out of the sheer knowledge that if I give myself any time to think about something, I always say no. So I just said yes right away. She came without ceremony to our front porch. Wendell had the kids camping that weekend, so I was alone. And she sat in that awkward space of trauma and anger and grief and inappropriate humor right next to my kids' backpacks and their trash I did not clean. I barely prepared. I gave her a pillow and a towel, and I don't even think I gave her a blanket. I think she just used like a throw from the couch, because that's where she slept. It was not complicated or fancy. She made me dinner and breakfast. We ordered sushi for lunch. She was quiet when she needed to be. She asked hard questions without fear. She spoke truth to me and over me. It was exactly what I didn't realize I needed. She was just with me. Now, while both of us will tell you we listen to our guts because that's how we've learned God speaks to us, it wasn't quite like a voice from the sky said, this is what you should do and how you should react to it. It wasn't magic. It took intention. We had to make our mindsets like Jesus. She wouldn't have offered otherwise, because this is not her personality either. I would not have accepted otherwise if we had not been making our mindset more like Jesus. It took effort. It took time and planning and, frankly, money for her to fly here to do that stuff for me. It took vulnerability because she had shared about her life and I had shared about mine. Those are the ways that God's teaching me to be with people. Maybe your children haven't experienced capital T traumas that inspire cross-country visits. Maybe they don't have to have legal or medical or academic interventions. Your marriage might be fine. It might not be buckling under the stress of the life that's surrounding you. Some of you aren't married. Some of you don't have children. Some of you have stable jobs. Some of you have secure upbringings. But even with all of those stories going on, I think there's probably things in all of our homes that are happening that we're not sharing with everybody, or in some cases, anybody. And that's what I want to challenge us to do today. Who do you have to be with you? I mean, you can look around. We should be with each other as a church family. And what are you willing to do to be with someone else? I am old enough to know that I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do this or what to do. That's not it. What I can do is tell you the pieces of my story in hopes that they're going to point you to God's story and how he's been with us, because this is how I've learned that God shows me that God's with me, through his people. Every year on my kids' birthdays, I write them blessings. If you're my Facebook friend, you've probably seen some of those. I've written blessings for graduations and weddings and birthdays. And because I think a blessing is one of the most powerful things that we have to give one another, I wrote one for today. And as the worship team comes back up, that's what I'm going to leave you with. May you, every single one of you, know that God is with you. May you know God is with you when you brush your teeth, when you do your dishes, on the way to school, in the drive-thru, at the ballpark, in your office, all of the everyday, ordinary places we go. May you know God is with you no matter your age, your race, your gender, your sexual identity, your marital status, your occupation. God is with you. And may you be with others. May you go to coffee. May you show up early or stay late. May you start a conversation. May you sit your chair right next to another person at the ball game and then sit next to that same person the next game and that same person the game after that. May you learn to love your front porch more than your backyard. May you make the call, send the message, share your stuff. May you go first. May you say, me too, and I know, and say more about that, and I'm here. May you show up with intention. May you put the work in. May you be vulnerable. May you be open. May you reflect Jesus, God with us in your everyday lives. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.